Nazario Moreno, leader of the La Familia Michoacana and Knights Templar cartels, was a unique figure even by the standards of Mexican organized crime, which is already rich in personalities. He didn't just create one of the country's leading criminal organizations, he built a true criminal cult, proclaiming himself a prophet and writing his own Bible. However, this did not prevent him from establishing such terror in his own territory that the residents of the state where Nazario's cartel was based began a guerrilla war against his organization. His cartel not only made money from drugs, but literally subjugated the entire economy of the state, from metal trade with China to ordinary citizens' rent payments. Nazario died twice, but only once for real, and his name is still written on the walls of houses with curses to burn in hell. Meet Nazario Moreno on the other side of the law. The state of Michoacán is located in western Mexico, along the Pacific Ocean and at the foot of the southern Sierra Madre Mountains. Michoacán's geographic location makes it strategically useful for those who want to transport something north along the Pacific coast. In addition, it's in this state that Lázaro Cárdenas, Mexico's busiest port, is located, connecting it with Asia, where tons of minerals from the rich Michoacán subsoil are shipped annually. However, despite all these natural resources, Michoacán is one of the poorest states in Mexico. The majority of the population are day laborers, smallholders, and poor farmers. Historically, Michoacán was also a stronghold of the leftist guerrilla movement in the 1970s and is considered one of the most religious states. It's here that Nazario Moreno González was born on March 8, 1970. In a poor village called Guanajuato. The village is located in the poorest part of the state, which the locals call El Infierno, or Little Hell. Nazario's family was considered poor even by local standards. He was one of 12 brothers and sisters abandoned by their alcoholic father. As Nazario recalls in his book, "My family and I lived in poverty. We dressed like homeless people in worn-out clothes. When we ate fried beans with oil, it was a luxury. As a child, I thought that rich people ate bread instead of tortillas and drank Coca-Cola instead of river water. No fruit, no sweets, nothing at all, just hunger and too much work." Nazario's mother, Maria, was a harsh woman and often punished her children. But in fact, Nazario himself was to blame. He was known throughout the neighborhood as a habitual fighter and was known as El Chayo, which means the madman. Nazario spent his entire childhood working in lime and cornfields. He had no time to go to school, so he learned to read at the age of 10 thanks to the comic book El Calimán. Calimán was a superhero crusader dressed in all white. He had various abilities such as levitation and telepathy, and was also a kung fu master. This hero clearly made a big impression on the young Nazario and remained in his heart forever. In his book, Nazario claimed that he had already developed extrasensory abilities as a child. For example, he could communicate with animals. This would be a ridiculous fact from the revelations of a half-madman, if not for one thing. Many of the residents of Michoacán who had encountered Moreno in one way or another claimed that he really could capture minds. Among the religious residents of the state, his name still evokes reverential horror. But whether these are superpowers or a good understanding of human psychology is still an open question. At the age of 12, Nazario began an independent life in the nearest large city, Apatzingán, and worked wherever he could, from cleaning up onions to selling matches. When he was 16, he and his brother left for California. In 1986, crossing the border was easy. They simply took a bus to Tijuana and then made their way through the countryside to Gringolandia, as he calls the United States in his book. From there, they made their way to San Francisco, where they stayed with a relative. Nazario got a job as a laborer for a landscape designer, but the grueling 11-hour shifts quickly wore him out, and he soon quit this thankless job in favor of drug dealing. He started out selling weed on the street and guarding stashes of merchandise. That's when he got his nickname. Gangsters from another group tried to drive him away from his sales spot, threatening him with a knife. Nazario took the knife and cut them both, which is why he was nicknamed El Más Loco, the craziest one. Nazario then obtained a 3-year work permit in the US so that he could legally travel between the States and Mexico. This was necessary in order for him to engage in smuggling on his own. In Michoacán, he found marijuana suppliers and transported the goods north himself, as well as smuggling cars, which he sold in Mexico without documents. In Mexico, he finally settled in Apatzingán. In the near future, this city would become the center of his criminal empire. But even then, in Nazario's youth, it was a city of crime with constant local shootouts in bars and many suspicious characters loitering in the streets. Moreno felt right at home in this world. He was described as a vicious and depraved young man of short stature, only 162 centimeters tall, or about 5'3", who was constantly drunk or high, and loved two types of leisure activities, either spending time with girls or picking fights. In 1989, Nazario ended up behind bars because of his violent temper. He was, as usual, getting drunk on the weekend when a local doctor who was too cocky gave him a dirty look. According to another version, Nazario himself wanted to take a ride in the doctor's nice car, but the man refused to give him the keys. Either way, the gangster pulled out a gun and shot the uncooperative doctor. He survived, and Nazario spent the next year, 1990, in prison in the state capital of Morelia. Of course, his first term in prison did not discourage him from continuing his criminal activities. On the contrary, it only fueled his desire. In the years following his release from prison, two important events occurred that had a major impact on Nazario's rise as a major crime boss. First, 4 of his brothers were killed. He was particularly affected by the murder of his brother Conchola, with whom he had started out in California. Conchola was betrayed by his own friends, and Nazario, upon learning of his death due to betrayal, became completely paranoid. Second, in 1994, Nazario himself nearly died in a fight over a trivial matter. The clash occurred at an amateur soccer match in Apatzingán, when Nazario went too far with his insults against his opponent and was literally trampled to the ground with boots, breaking his skull. Such injuries were not treated in Apatzingán, so Moreno transferred to Mexico City. There, surgeons opened up his skull and inserted a steel plate. Nazario survived and avoided becoming a vegetable, but the injury made him even more crazy. And he writes in his book that after that, he began to see hallucinations and rethought his life, having been on the verge of death and seeing God. Nazario then left for the US and settled in McAllen, Texas, where he got involved with marijuana. He quit drinking and went through a 12-step program. Religion became a substitute for alcohol and drugs for Nazario. He attended meetings of American evangelists, and he liked this faith no less than Mexican Catholicism, because it said that everyone should follow their dreams and deserves better. Nazario Moreno's dream was to become a big-time drug lord. And in his crazy mind, this was perfectly compatible with religion. It was entirely possible to sell meth, cut off the heads of enemies, and still be a devout follower of Christ. He took convenient passages from the Bible that could justify his activities and simply ignored the inconvenient ones, seasoning it all with wisdom gleaned from the Kaliman comics, and even from the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson, which he loved tremendously and forced new recruits to watch. The warriors in kilts from Scotland fighting the evil English king resonated with his own struggle in the countryside against the elite Mexico City and their chain dogs, the Federales. All this jumble of ideas became the foundation of the future La Familia Michoacán. By the beginning of the 21st century, Nazario was working under Carlos Rosales, one of the allies of Osiel Cardenas, the boss of the Gulf cartel. Rosales was then competing with the Valencia family, the main drug traffickers in all of Michoacán, who in turn had an alliance with Sinaloa. At this stage, Nazario was in charge of operations within the United States. Based in McAllen, directly opposite Reynosa, the stronghold of the Gulf cartel, Moreno would smuggle drugs into Texas. In 2003, an arrest warrant was issued for him for distributing methamphetamine and involvement in a deal for 5 tons of the drug. Nazario went on the run and continued to run operations from underground for another year. The beginning of his rise coincided with major changes not only in organized crime in Mexico, but also in the political system. In 2000, the Institutional Revolutionary Party's rule and the one-party system that had held power in the country for almost a century, including coexisting quite comfortably with the drug cartels, came to an end. Vicente Fox, a Democrat who promised to fight the drug traffickers, became president, but his plan would not be. He did, of course, begin to crack down on the cartels, but only those in the north, first arresting Cardenas and then Rosales. The Gulf cartel fell apart, but at the same time, El Chapo escaped from prison and began an unprecedented effort to elevate Sinaloa. All this inevitably led to accusations that Fox was collaborating with the more compliant Sinaloans. In other words, corruption was not eradicated with the arrival of a democratic president, but simply took on other forms, fighting some cartels with the help of others. The Democrats did not, as the general public had hoped, make Mexican officials honest. Many continued to take bribes, but now everyone was on different sides of the barricades, because in many Mexican states, the PRI remained the main party, while some states remained radical left-wing. The disparity led to a real disaster. Add to this the emergence of new types of organizations such as Los Zetas, and you get the explosion of violence that actually happened. An additional factor was the division within the police. Drug traffickers could pay officials in the city or state, but federal officers could work for a competitor. The police began to fight each other, feds against municipal officers. The government lost its ability to act as an arbiter that could control organized crime. Instead, gangsters themselves began to challenge authority with weapons. And so, in this turbulent time, Nazario returned from Texas around 2004. A vacuum had formed in Michoacán due to the arrest of drug lords Valencia and Rosales. He had a chance to fill it, but there was a problem. He was not Rosales' only ambitious lieutenant. José de Jesus Méndez, nicknamed El Mono, also had his sights set on the boss's position, and Nazario made a deal with him to divide Michoacán. Then Nazario seized the moment. In 2005, El Chapo Guzman's Sinaloa cartel clashed with the Gulf Zetas cartel. Moreno collaborated with the latter and turned to them for help in finishing off the remnants of Valencia's cartel in his territory and continuing to cooperate with them in the future. That is, to give Michoacán to Los Zetas. Well, at least that's what they thought. Nazario and his men trained in Los Zetas camps and learned their tactics of warfare. With the support of Los Zetas, Nazario quickly defeated Valencia in early 2006, and then after clearing Michoacán, he made a tactical U-turn and flipped against Los Zetas. And this is where the story of La Familia Michoacana begins. To win over the locals, Nazario developed a media image for his organization as autodefensas of the people and defenders of the common folk against the lawlessness of Los Zetas. At first, people believed them, and even started giving money to drive Los Zetas out of their land. But they fell into a trap because Nazario and his gang were no better. The struggle between La Familia and Los Zetas was bloody and long, as we discussed in our video about Los Zetas and we'll discuss in our upcoming video about the Jalisco New Generation cartel. But in addition to the standard activities of Mexican cartels of that period, such as scattering the bodies of enemies and filming videos, Nazario began to work with the population. He cared for them, but in his own insane way. In essence, he established an alternative justice system in which he dispensed justice, speaking on behalf of God. His local men punished those who raped or robbed people who were already poor. Suspected criminals were whipped, as in ancient Rome, paraded through the streets with signs saying, "I am a rat," or even crucified. La Familia also offered debt collection services to locals. For just a third of the amount owed, they would persuade any debtor to return the money. Otherwise, all their property would be seized and they would be expelled from Michoacán. It must be said that his system of justice initially received support from the population of poor areas, because they were already constantly balancing on the edge of the law, and here they could get at least some justice, since those in power generally didn't care about the problems of the poor. By the end of 2006, Nazario had written his first work, entitled Pensamientos, or Thoughts. These thoughts reflected Moreno's crazy mix of ideas, and he forced all new recruits brought to La Familia's training bases to study his work. For a whole week, all they did was read Thoughts, eating only once a day. At the end of the week, Nazario, dressed in white, would come out to the new chambers of La Familia with a sermon. The restless and religious poor of Michoacán truly believed in his chosen status and went about their criminal activities under the protection of Saint Nazario. Moreno managed to create a real criminal sect. He also came up with an original recruitment tactic. He financed Christian rehabilitation centers for alcoholics and drug addicts, where his cult was preached. From there came a steady stream of recruits, whom he gave hope for a better future, since he himself had once suffered from addiction. Saint Nazario served a criminal purpose, and his gang did not just commit senseless murders. They waged a holy war. And their main weapon was not only force, it was meth. By the beginning of the 21st century, America's favorite drug had changed. Now it was methamphetamine. And by 2005, after the passage of a law recognizing meth precursors as illegal substances, production in the United States had come to a standstill. But demand still remained, and the Mexicans seized the opportunity. Several organizations became the kings of crystal meth. First and foremost, there was the pioneer from Jalisco, Ignacio Nacho Coronel, whom I will discuss in detail in the video about the CJNG, and of course, Nazario El Más Loco Moreno. Several factors played into the hands of La Familia Michoacana. First, many Michoacanos had lived in the US for a long time and had been cooking meth since the 90s. Nazario himself, as you may recall, was accused of selling a large batch of speed back in 2003, 2 years before the 2005 law. Second, the port of Lázaro Cárdenas in Michoacán is the gateway to China from where legal ingredients for meth production began to be supplied. Nazario set up the supply chain and huge shipments began to arrive in Mexico, allowing meth to be produced not in hundreds, but tons of kilograms. To this end, huge laboratories were set up in the mountains, and the best chemists were hired. And if they didn't want to be hired, they were kidnapped. These efforts led to Mexican gangsters developing a stronger product than American cooks had ever had. These were the very crystals of white, blue, or pink color, almost 100% pure, which were called ice. Meth has a very low threshold of addiction. 1 or 2 doses are enough to create an irresistible desire to use more. For the gringo trade, it was the perfect item, but for La Familia soldiers, not so much. A former drug addict and alcoholic himself, Nazario was very strict with those who abused the product. Therefore, he banned the sale of his ice in Michoacán. The distribution network across North America grew by the hour. La Familia shipped and distributed meth through a network of immigrants from Michoacán. The largest distribution centers were located in California, Texas, and Georgia, but its tentacles reached many other states, including New York, Missouri, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Colorado, both Carolinas, and Washington. Nazario, a man who never went to school and thought as a child that only rich people drink Coca-Cola, became the head of a veritable multi-billion-dollar industry. To protect it, he created a private army of several thousand men, which was present in all the municipalities of Michoacán and spread to the surrounding territories, the states of Guerrero, Guanajuato, Jalisco, and Mexico City. And this was a mistake. The larger the organization, the more noticeable it is. The Michoacán traffickers were no longer scattered and weak, but had become one of Mexico's largest cartels. And when President Calderón, a native of Michoacán, came to power in 2006, he singled out La Familia as the first organization he wanted to destroy. Nazario's war with Los Zetas was compounded by a war with the federal state. Calderón's offensive against the drug cartels was backed by the army. At the peak of the campaign, more than 100,000 soldiers from all branches of the military were involved in fighting cartels in 12 states. The Mexican government had used the army against gangsters before, but never on such a scale. And this, of course, caused a real collapse. The cartels had grown fangs during the prior period of lawlessness and were not willing to give up their territories so easily. La Familia adopted the best tactics from Los Zetas, and weapons flowed freely from Texas stores through methamphetamine smuggling routes. And so the bloodshed began. In May 2007, a column of soldiers crossed the hills near the town of Caracuaro when about 30 men ambushed them. 5 soldiers were killed, the biggest loss for the Mexican army since the Zapatista uprising in 1994. Calderón called the dead national heroes and ordered more troops to be sent in. They came under even heavier fire in Apatzingan, when a group of armed men barricaded themselves in a house and held the soldiers at bay for 2 hours in a protracted firefight in broad daylight. That was only the beginning. Over the next few years, the term narco-blockade would become the most popular word in media headlines. Ambushes with burning cars and subsequent strafing of the impact zone with 50 caliber weapons were La Familia's most guerrilla-like tactics, learned from Los Zetas. Nazario's army numbered between 4,000 and 10,000 men, and the war with the state became prolonged because the army was fighting beyond the lines of Michoacán. La Familia's strategy was to attack constantly to show their presence. Even if the attacks were doomed to failure in advance, this wore down the soldiers and at the same time demonstrated to the population that the cartel still had enough strength to fight. Such stories also distracted attention at the moments when they needed to transport a shipment. The Mexican army was indeed exhausted and embittered, and began to launch retaliatory strikes, which often hit local residents. In one horrific incident, 4 teenage girls said that soldiers took them to a base where they were beaten and raped for several days. The attack occurred shortly after a drug ambush in which 5 soldiers were killed. Perhaps it was revenge by the soldiers. Pressure on ordinary people was also increasing from the cartels. Nazario punished anyone suspected of collaborating with the army. Los Zetas, Nazario's worst enemies, who wanted to take revenge on him for his betrayal, were not idle either. On September 15, 2008, Mexico's Independence Day was celebrated in the central square of the state capital, Morelia. At 11 o'clock, 2 explosions rocked the crowd. 8 people were killed, more than 100 were injured, and some were left disabled. A week later, security forces arrested 3 men for the attack. They confessed on camera that they were members of Los Zetas and had thrown the grenades. The question hung in the air. Why? Why attack civilians during a holiday? This was a direct terrorist threat. The answer was simple. Los Zetas pulled their usual trick, albeit on a scale of brutality unusual even for them, called calentar la plaza, or heating up the plaza. When an act of violence is committed on enemy territory that forces the government to mobilize all its forces in one place and, accordingly, disrupts the work of La Familia, weakening it. And since the authorities had not paid attention to the deaths of drug traffickers in recent years, they had to attack civilians in order to heat up the desired territory. But as always, in the fog of the Mexican drug war, nothing can be said with certainty. Shortly after the explosion, rumors spread that Nazario himself could have been behind the attack. He responded to the government's military offensive with terror that would have shaken faith in the government once and for all, but blamed Los Zetas for it in order to maintain local support. In 2015, doubts grew even more when a judge released 3 suspects, ruling that they had been tortured into confessing. After the attack in Morelia, Calderon put more pressure on Michoacán. So if it was Los Zetas, their plan to heat up the plaza was a success. Federal police, a kind of aristocracy among Mexico's police forces, were sent to Michoacán. Wearing masks and black armor, the federales were better educated and armed than army soldiers. When Calderon came to power, the federales had only 6,000 officers for the whole of Mexico. By the end of his reign, they numbered 37,000. They were paid the equivalent of a hefty $1,000 a month. The new officers quickly realized that they would not be able to catch Nazario Moreno in the mountains, so they sought out the local gangsters' weak spot: family gatherings such as birthdays, christenings, and simple family gatherings with music and dancing. In April 2009, 400 federal agents raided the christening of a baby born to a member of La Familia. They captured 44 gangsters. Among them was Nazario's trusted lieutenant, Rafael Cadeño, who posed as a state human rights commissioner when he executed people. In July 2009, federal agents captured La Familia's trusted lieutenant, Arnaldo La Mensa Rueda Medina, in a safe house on the outskirts of Morelia. He was pushed into a car when armed men ran out of a neighboring house. They started shooting and throwing grenades at the officers' cars, but the federal agents fought back and managed to leave the scene. That same morning, La Familia called its people to arms throughout Michoacán. They drove in columns to police bases and fired on them with large-caliber weapons and threw grenades, ambushed police patrol cars, and stormed hotels where the police were staying. Over the course of 3 days, La Familia carried out 23 attacks, killing 16 federal agents and wounding many others. Then, immediately after the wave of attacks, La Familia raised the white flag, La Tuta. The organization's main spokesperson delivered a message live on a news show, saying that they wanted their families to be left alone, that they actually respected both the army and the navy, but that business was business and would not end, that drugs were a necessary evil, and that everyone should live in harmony. La Tuta's main idea was that the gangsters would back down if the government backed down. La Familia simply wanted the Mexican government to leave them alone. However, the government did not back down. In December 2010, acting on a tip, the feds gathered about 2,000 soldiers to catch up with Nazario Moreno at a party in the godforsaken village of El Alcalde. On December 8th, huge columns of federal police rolled down the roads. Helicopters buzzed over the hills. Nazario understood it all and gave the order to counterattack. On the dirt road at the entrance of El Alcalde, a drug blockade of more than 40 trucks with 500 heavily armed killers instantly sprang up. This battle turned out to be one of the fiercest in the Mexican drug war, and indeed in the country's recent history as a whole. One of the police helicopters was almost shot down by a large caliber Browning. The shootouts continued throughout the night and the following day. La Familia began attacking other police positions, and shootouts broke out in 12 municipalities in Michoacán. The gangsters also seized dozens of trucks and buses and burned them on major highways, blocking police traffic. In total, federal agents shot and killed more than 50 cartel members. Officially, 5 federal police officers were killed and others were wounded, but unofficially, the number of officers killed was reported to be over 50 or even 60. At least 3 civilians were also killed. During this massacre, Nazario fled El Alcalde with a group of gunmen to a nearby village called Holanda. Federal agents caught up with him halfway there, leading to another fierce shootout. In the chaos, officers claimed to have shot Nazario, but said his riflemen had dragged his body into the mountains. Moreno's body was not found, but Security Service spokesman Alejandro Puerre made a public statement at a press conference on December 10th, reporting that the authorities had killed Nazario on December 9th, the second day of the battle. 4 days later, President Calderón himself made a statement. A little later, police discovered several graves in a remote village, among them the grave of Moreno with a large statue of Narco Saint Nazario on it. Later still, a video surfaced online in which La Tura allegedly declared himself the boss of La Familia. But all this was one big hoax. In reality, Nazario was not only alive, but also had ambitions for the future. His supposed death even worked in his favor. He was able to dismantle La Familia, which had already begun to fragment due to its size, and create a new cartel with himself as the prophet, and he named it the Knights Templar cartel. First, the organization was purged of traitors and suspicious elements. Second, Nazario finally established his image as a prophet and even thought out a concept. His killers became Templars, sacred soldiers. The Red Cross of the Templars became a distinguishing mark in secret houses and on weapons. Nazario even came up with a coat of arms. It depicted the face of Saint Nazario in the upper left corner, Jesus on the right, the Templar cross in the lower left corner, and an axe and mace in the lower right corner. He also developed a pocketbook of Templar codes, which listed 53 commandments, as well as special ceremonies in which gangsters dressed up as knights to initiate new members. However, not everything was so fun. At these ceremonies, new recruits were forced to kill people and eat their flesh. An aura of mystery immediately began to surround the new organization. Thanks to Nazario, he generously paid musicians to compose songs about the brave Templars and bribed journalists. Only the most loyal followers were allowed to join the new gang. The rest remained in La Familia, which the Knights Templar had declared war on. Thus, the Templars were actually the core of the cartel, and those who remained under the name La Familia were a splinter group. The remnants of La Familia were driven out to neighboring Guerrero and the state of Mexico near the capital and still operates as small gangs. From 2011, Nazario Moreno and his Templars became the rulers of Michoacán and set to work. There was not a single area in the state where they did not extend their reach. They took over the lime, avocado, livestock, construction, real estate, and mining industries. In fact, it became difficult to do any business without the Templars wanting a piece of the pie. The Templars' first step in their new business was extortion, which began several years before when Nazario collected tribute from residents to help them fight the Zetas. Many people began to pay voluntarily, believing that it was better to pay Nazario because Los Zetas were worse. And so, gradually, all small businesses ended up in the hands of the cartel. Every restaurant, every dance hall, every shop, every private gas station. Everyone paid. The Templars became so powerful that they even preyed on transnational corporations such as large mining and agricultural companies. They even attacked Pepsi's shipments for the same purpose of extortion. Agriculture in Michoacán became a particularly lucrative business for the Templars. They taxed farmers for every kilo of avocados they grew. They also sucked money out of all links in the production chain, including wholesalers, produce shops, and exporters. The same thing happened in all areas of agriculture. A telling example of their power is the episode with the global increase in lime prices, which they provoked. Limes are widely used in Mexican cuisine and are sold at the regional market in Apatzingan. Wholesalers and producers made cash deals, as many farmers did not accept checks. The Citrus Growers Association set the daily price, but the Templars took control of the association and began setting prices with their own markup. In 2013 to 2014, they raised the price of limes so high that it led to increased costs for bars and restaurants across North America and reduced the availability of lime juice in many establishments. The Templars also took control of metal mining when the Chinese economy was booming and its factories were hungry for Mexican minerals. From the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, loaded ships sailed directly to Shanghai around the clock. In the first 6 months of 2013, ships carried a record 5.5 million tons of iron from mines owned by the Knights Templar. Of course, they didn't comply with any environmental requirements, which in the future led to many of them closing. But at the time, the Templar cartel was one of the most successful global leaders in the mining industry. And the most epic moment of Nazario Moreno's power was his extortion of officials. For decades, cartels paid the state to leave them alone, but in Michoacán, the situation was reversed. Mayors and deputies paid 10% of their budget to the Templar cartel so that they would be left alone. The state could do nothing about Moreno's power. He was everywhere. His colorful, tasteless mansions worth tens of millions of dollars sprang up in all the towns and villages of Michoacán on land where the local residents had been driven out from. The violence continued, with no end in sight. And then Nazario's actions awakened a real monster. Dishwashers, lime pickers, doctors, teachers, and other ordinary people rose up against injustice. This is how the self-defense squads were born. A new, even more insane round of war began in 2013, and its face was concerned citizens. By that year, the Templars' abuses had reached a fever pitch. The bandits continued to expand their demands. They charged fees for the right to hold private parties, for the purchase of new cars or plasma TVs, and even the square footage of apartments and houses. At first, these were public police units, whose existence was even approved by the president. No one could stop these men's units. The leaders of the self-defense squads gathered in the squares and divided into army patrols of 10 people. The last straw for the coming generalized terror was the use of violence against women as a means of pressure. The Templars went so far as to hang around schools looking for girls they wanted to rape. The first uprisings took place in La Ruana and Tepalcatepec. At first, there were only a dozen people, but after a few hours, 100 armed citizens were already at the cattle market, where the Templars were supposed to come to collect their tribute, ready to fight back. The Templar thugs did not show up that day, but attacked a few weeks later, killing one of the Autodefensa's vigilantes. But the troops shot several cartel members in response. The war began and lasted a whole year. There's a widespread legend that the self-defense squads were led by the Jalisco New Generation cartel, but in fact, this is not entirely true. Certainly, they sponsored some players within the movement, but in general, it was still a genuine people's initiative, sponsored by many, because any war costs money. The enemies of the Templars contributed some money for weapons, but concerned Michoacanos, including those living in the USA, also donated a lot of money to support their brave brothers. The self-defense units created a militarized structure. They formed units of 10 to 20 people with a commander. They reported to mid-level commanders, who in turn reported to regional commanders. About 30 regional commanders formed a governing council. Many of the vigilantes had served in the army, and they taught others combat techniques. They obtained most of their weapons from the United States. The vast majority of cars entering Mexico were not searched at the time, so it was easy to drive south with trucks full of rifles. To increase their chances against the Templars, the Autodefensas built their own homemade armored vehicles, known as narco-tanks, borrowing techniques from Los Zetas. The emergence of the self-defense squads coincided with the start of the term of the new president Enrique Peña Nieto, who for a long time could not decide how to deal with them. At first, they were persecuted and arrested for possession of weapons, but the arrests had no deterrent effect, and the vigilante movement continued to grow. After a few months, suppressing the popular uprising would have meant arresting thousands of people. So the Peña Nieto government resorted to ignoring it. The reality was that in a few months, the self-defense groups had become a formidable force that changed the course of Mexico's war on drugs. The first line of defense was on the road from Buenavista to Apatzingan. The self-defense groups built a network of 5 barricades there to repel attacks by the Templars. Then the Vigilantes went on the offensive, developing tactics for capturing villages first. They contacted local residents who would help fight the cartel. Then they attacked, using overwhelming force with hundreds of armed men and dozens of trucks. When they occupied a town, they gathered the residents in the square and declared the village or town liberated. The locals then built their own barricades, expanding the autodefensa's territory. By October, 7 months after the uprising, the self-defense squads had recaptured most of the territory. And in January 2014, the autodefensas began to storm the Templars' main stronghold, Apatzingan. The president had to take action, and several thousand soldiers and federal agents arrived in Michoacán to try to disarm the autodefensas. However, hundreds of local residents surrounded the troops and demanded that their weapons be returned to the Vigilantes. Unlike the soldiers, they had saved them for the tyranny of the Templars. The residents insisted and refused to disperse, so the soldiers opened fire, killing 3 people, including an 11-year-old girl. Television footage of her small coffin outraged many Mexicans. Not only had the security forces failed to protect the people from the cartels, but they had also killed a child. Sensing the mood, the Peña Nieto administration changed its position. It decided that Vigilantes were clearly winning, and the security forces would cooperate with them to pursue the cartel. The federal police suffered heavy losses at the hands of the Templars, so its officers were happy to coordinate with the self-defense units. The self-defense movement, strangely enough, already in alliance with the feds, was approaching Apatzingan, and the villages on the outskirts of the city rebelled. The deeper the autodefensas penetrated into Templar territory, the more Templar killers they captured. And, oddly enough, they gave them an offer to switch to the light side. But Apatzingan itself, a real stronghold of the Nazario Moreno empire, caused some concern for the self-defense squads. The problem was that the autodefensas had difficulty finding allies in the city. In most cities, they could find enough residents who wanted to take revenge on the Templars. But Apatzingan was the birthplace of the cartel, and the residents were more loyal. And they were more afraid of retaliation from the mystical Nazario, who, according to rumors, was very good at remembering people's faces. In the end, the Vigilantes found their ally in the most unexpected and, at the same time, predictable place in light of Nazario Moreno's history: the church. Santo Nazario's main opponent was a real priest named Padre Goyo. His sermons became rallies for the overthrow of the Templars, changing the minds of the locals. Sensing the right moment, the self-defense units attacked Apatzingan at dawn on Saturday, February 8, 2014. They moved simultaneously in 5 columns and established bases around the perimeter of the city. The largest was in the market, which became the headquarters of the new authorities. Soon, city officials and businessmen went there to surrender to the leaders of the autodefensas. By nightfall, the Templars had not attacked them, and the next morning, the jubilant self-defense squads made a triumphant drive through the city center in a column of 120 trucks, in which armed and very happy people sat in tight rows. Soldiers and police walked alongside, and now it was absolutely clear to everyone that Nazario Moreno was alive and well. He had retreated to his native lands, moving through the triangle of mountains between Apatzingan, Aguirilla, and Arteaga. People there still sheltered him, and he moved through the hills, which only mules could traverse, constantly changing houses. Self-defense squads conducted search operations and took control of villages to gradually close in on him. And they would finally do so in March. As usual, there are several versions of the story. The first belongs to the government. In it, Nazario met his end in the early morning of March 9th. After celebrating his 44th birthday, Marines reported finding him high in the mountains. When they ordered him to surrender, he fired and they shot him. To prove that he was definitely dead, photos of his fingerprints and a video showing his corpse with a blackened, beaten face were published. Immediately, a multitude of details emerged. One agent told a Mexican newspaper that Nazario was allegedly riding alone on a mule when he was found. Another claimed that he was with a girl at the time of his capture. There are good reasons to doubt the official version. Despite the fact that Nazario had lost most of his support, it is strange that he was alone. Plus, such luck for the Federales. Encountering the elusive boss on a mule seems unbelievable. The government also gave no explanation for the bruises on his face. And here, there's a second version. And this is what Nazario feared the most: betrayal. According to some reports, the autodefensas conspired with Nazario's bodyguards to get rid of him. The bodyguards realized that their boss had lost and were tired of his increasingly uncontrollable behavior. While Moreno was celebrating his birthday, they attacked him and held him until the autodefensas arrived. The vigilantes and bodyguards beat him and sent him to the other world. They handed his body over to the Marines, which was beneficial to everyone. It increased the government's authority and at the same time freed the self-defense squads from accusations of murder. Even in death, Nazario remained shrouded in mystery, just as he had been in life. Some conspiracy theorists even say that he did not die at all. When the government made a mistake or lied once, it was easy to believe that it could do so again. But this time there was compelling evidence. The government had the body. After a lavish memorial service, Nazario Moreno was buried somewhere in his native hills. The location of his remains is unknown. His family carefully conceals his final resting place for fear that it will be desecrated. Within weeks of Nazario's death, his Knights Templar empire collapsed. The remaining cities fell, and the Templars' money collectors stopped coming. Almost all of the cartel's high-ranking members were killed or arrested. In 2014, Peña Nieto faced a problem of what to do with thousands of vigilantes, many of whom were former Templars. He decided to give them badges. Thus, a new state rural force was created from the autodefensas in uniform. But it was a bad decision. Residents began to complain that former members of the self-defense squads were shaking them down for money, and these units were disbanded. The collapse of the Templars also provided a major boost to their rivals, the CJNG. They took over the Templars' meth smuggling routes, adding them to their empire, which now stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. They also copied the guerrilla tactics of the Templars and Los Zetas, and even reinforced them. Thus, the gangster capitalism model of Nazario and Los Zetas became the new standard model for organized crime in Mexico. Even in the media ghost of the immortal El Mencho, one can sense the same sectarian spirit of El Mas Loco, which still hovers over the troubled lands of long-suffering Mexico.